Shalom, 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 ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a live episode of Faith Walk, the intersection of life and faith. It is the last day of July, July 31st, 2024, and it's a great day to be alive and well. Aisha, I saw you before we even went on the air that you were in the chat. You are going at your sister's throat. Let me tell you. I think you might only be one horse behind Ayana. So, honey bunches, I don't know. Your sister's bringing up the rear. Thank you for being the first one, Aisha. Love you. Aisha's the first one in the chat today, and she says, "Good evening, all. Good evening, Aisha." Ladies and gentlemen, we have a great show in store for you tonight. We are starting our The Black Man series tonight, and we have a special expert guest, Dr. Daniel Lee, and he is a Black man, and he's going to be sharing some of his expertise about being a Black man from the psychological perspective, the mental health perspective, as well as his own lived experience. And he's written one book and is about to publish another book. And that book is going to share information about how Black men, and not just Black men, anyone, but we're going to specifically tailor it for Black men tonight, can achieve some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight, that may be some of the challenges. But when Dr. Lee's book comes out shortly, it's 6 stages of 4 purposeful living. And he's going to go through some of the stages to talk about what Black men can do to achieve their goals and overcome some of the challenges that we're seeing in society today with Black men. So I'm excited. This is going to be an awesome series. Tell your friends, tell your families. And it's not just for Black men, it's for men and women, because we have to learn how to support, undergird, advocate, and encourage our Black men in their present and into their next. And some of us don't know how to do that. And so we're going to hear from Black men about how others can support, encourage, advocate for, etc., them, as well as them doing it for themselves. So don't keep all this great and wonderful information to yourself. Subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're watching via YouTube. Follow the Facebook page if you're watching via Facebook. Like the video. It helps the algorithm. If you like the video, it gets the show in front of more eyeballs. And share the video. Don't keep all this great and wonderful information to yourself. So I'm going to bring up my co-host right now, Sandra Lee, and we're going to get this ball and this roll.
Hey, Sharon.
Hi, Sandra. How are you?
I'm doing excitingly well, and I cannot wait to bring up Dr. Lee. I know that he has a lot to share, so I am just so excited.
And there's no relation that they know of with Dr.
That
Daniel
we know of.
Sandra Lee. But you never know, right? It's a small world.
Right. Check the family line and see what happens.
That's right. Honey Bunches says, "Good evening." Hi, Honey Bunches. Honey Bunches, I think you're only one show ahead of your sister. And so she's coming up on your heels. She was in the chat before we even went live. Now, you know she's hungry to be. So I'm just saying.
Faithful.
Netta says, GE, good evening to all. Oh, my mom is.
Whoa.
Let me just say this one little funny thing. But when I first told my mom how to text years ago, eons ago, 20 years ago, I'm hearing the feedback. I don't know if you all can hear it. I hope you don't. But anyway, she would make up her own text language. Like when I would send her abbreviations and say what it meant. So then she started making up abbreviations that weren't, common to everyone. I'm like, I don't understand this. Like, what is this? Well, you said we can abbreviate it. No. You want to follow the handbook. You can't just make
it. Right. That's not how that works.
She tried. All right. So she got the GE for good evening. So I'm proud of you, Mom.
Right. Good going, Netta.
Yes. Kevin says, "Good morning, beautiful people." Kevin, are you on the other side of the globe? Good morning.
Good morning, Kevin. Hey, Kevin.
He's probably at the Olympics.
Oh, yeah.
Kevin says, here's the feedback too. Well, we can see if anybody, Sandra or Dr. Lee, if you have your phone on, and I'm going to turn mine off as well, because maybe that's it. I don't know. Honey Bunches says, let's see here if I can get that up here. Yes, we are hearing the feedback. Okay. And then Kevin says, good evening. Yes, I guess you're not in Paris. All right. So we're going to bring up Dr. Lee. Let me hold on one second. I'm trying to, oh, here we go. Got to get this thing right. Dr. Lee, how are you?
Hey, how you doing today? Well, good evening, I should say.
Hello, Dr. Lee.
How you doing? I'm gonna call you
Doing
Cuss
wonderful. I
Lamont
can't
since you
wait.
don't know yet.
I cannot wait to hear what you got to tell us.
All right, man.
Well, first of all, let's let Dr. Lee introduce himself and share with the audience his background, educational background, what he's working on today. He's currently working on a new book and past, and your expertise in the mental health and psychological world, Dr. Lee.
All right, well, Sharon, I was gonna say it's good to see you again. I know it's been a long time. I'm glad you invited me back to the show. So my name is Dr. Lee. Right now, I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm a medical director at a local university running their wellness center. I also have a private practice, Insight Psychological Services. In terms of my overall background, I specialize in clinical psychology, school psychology. Also have a certification in special education, and I completed my my postdoctoral master's in clinical psychopharmacology, which means that I'm working towards the ability to prescribe as a psychologist, which you can do in certain states. So I'm focusing on New Mexico at this point. And in addition to that, I was certified as a life coach, and I also wrote my first book I co-authored with Fred Anderson called Do What You're Built For. And it really was a book based on life coaching principles. I wanted to make sure that people could figure out sort of how to access sort of coaching resources if you couldn't find a coach like me around. And then I was sort of encouraged by some colleagues who helped establish the Built For Collective to update the Do What You Build For model. And now we're looking at six stages of purposeful living in terms of Do What You Build For. So it's just a book that really, hopefully it'll get into the conversation tonight. It's more for folks who are looking how to sort of live that space with balance, vulnerability. And I think for Black men in particular, we need to learn how to live in that space of balance, vulnerability, and be able to communicate and then be able to sort of live our lives by stretching and growing ourselves on a day-to-day basis. Because one thing I would say, if you leave with 2 points tonight, as a Black man, sometimes I feel like people, want what we represent, but they might not necessarily want who we are. And I think that's the tension point of being a Black man. And I think, I want you to leave with this quote, how you have to address that. And this is a quote by T.J. Rogers, J.T. Rogers, that says, "Be realistic, expect the impossible." And I think as a Black man, that's how you have to live life every day. You gotta expect the impossible from yourself. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, and then we'll kind of see where we go from here.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Thank you for that introduction. There's so much that you do. And I know last time, Dr. Lee, when we talked, you were working on, as you said, psychologists being able to prescribe, which I think is so important because of the level one of education that you have. And more people who are seeing psychologists rather than going to a psychiatrist. Because a lot of people who I know who are psychiatrists, people go to them just to get the medication, but they're seeking therapy elsewhere from a psychologist or therapist, etc. Exactly. So why not allow the psychologist to prescribe the medication, as long as obviously you have the right, training and, like you said, pharmacology, etc. So can you just share a little bit about how far that's gotten? Is that about to happen? Has it already happened in New Jersey, Pennsylvania?
So it's in about 8-9 states about now around the country. So I think Vermont might be the latest state that introduced legislation. In terms of the tri-state area, Pennsylvania has introduced legislation, but it hasn't moved in terms of becoming signed into law. The state that has been doing it the longest is New Mexico. And that pretty much is like the model for a lot of the states to sort of operationalize. So I'm gearing my training to be licensed in New Mexico so I can really continue sort of professional growth in that area. So when I'm assuming maybe Pennsylvania might be the first state maybe to pick it up. So then I can come and sort of translate my skills from New Mexico to locally. It
Oh,
really
that,
for me, it really for me is this ideal of access to care, sort of what you mentioned. I mean, really from an equity perspective, particularly for poor folks, older folks, they don't have access to and I would say high quality care sometimes, and I would
mhm.
say and there's fewer people going into psychiatric sort of fields. And because of that combination, a lot of them, they're in demand, and most of them are out of
Yeah,
pocket, private pay. So you have to find them, and some of them, pretty much most, if not all of them, have wait lists. So depending on where you're at, just accessing the support. So then you have primary care, sort of assuming a lot of responsibilities, and a lot of them are not as comfortable with managing all of the complications related to psychotropics. So it really is an opportunity for psychologists to sort of serve. And for me, what I would like to do is not just do this work, but really start thinking about how do we create training programs, particularly in our Medicaid funded sort of communities, organizations, and populations. So we have a continual pathway and a pipeline for services once it gets signed into law.
okay. And so since your office is in Philly, so that would be great if Pennsylvania adopts that because most of the people, I'll say most because our audience is growing, but a lot of people who are watching live in this tri-state area, Pennsylvania, New
Mhm.
Jersey, Delaware. So that would be awesome. And I so appreciate you, heading that task force to make that happen because it's just, it's past due. So I appreciate that work that you're doing. I'm going to bring Sandra Lee back up on the stage now, and let's see what happens with the feedback. So far, so good.
Hey.
So let's start off with this question. Dr. Lee, tell us what you like most about being a Black man.
Oh, wow.
You know, it's interesting. And I'll be very transparent. I think I had to grow into loving being a Black man, and I think it's, I'm growing up. I'm a child of the '70s and '80s where it was, and I guess growing up in settings where it was a lot of mixed messages around what it was to be Black and what it meant. Even for me, I was a poor Black person. So it was like, what are those messages that are around? Like sometimes I have to look at my life and say, but we didn't have the ACEs sort of assessments where you looked at average childhood sort of incidents. But if I had to fill it out as a child, I think I would probably be a 5 or a 6 or a 7. It's like, so I had a lot. It's like in terms of what I was competing with. But one of the things I would say is, as Black men, we're not monoliths. And I think we always have to say that as a Black people. So, as much as I love Shaka Khan and say, like I'm every woman, I can't say I'm every man and things like
Right.
that. But all that to say is, I think the one commonality that we have is that, and I think going back to the love of self is, I think most, if not all of us, have to grow into that. And then we want to put ourselves in environments where we were reinforced. So I had a great mama, I think, who really served and gave the space around sacrificial love. So for me, I had to understand that as a standard. And then how to translate that into personal value. Once I've adopted that and integrated that in my life, then who I am became everything, because all I really understand is that because of that sacrificial love experience and everything I got out of it, that demonstrated I had worth. And I think what I would encourage everybody is to find that space in your life where people have demonstrated you have as worth. And I think for Black men, we may need it even more because we're competing in a society where the message is we don't. And I think, and you have moments where you're competing with the microaggressions, the outright racism, and the attacks at times. And that's challenging. So, I think, it's something I think we have to be honest with ourselves around. We have some forces we're competing with, but the ideal is we don't want to internalize that. So all that to answer your question is, once you get to that space, and you love everything about yourself, and then you want to communicate that.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Lee, do you have any sons?
It's two.
Two. So
Mhm.
how does that message, how do you get that message to your sons, so what you went through, maybe they can get there sooner, as far as, you know, really appreciating being a Black man and walking in that strength?
You know, I can give the story of when I guess Barack Obama was elected the first time. We were in Jamaica, and I remember having to drag my son might have been about 7 at that point, or maybe 7, 6 or 7. And I remember dragging him and his sister off the beach, and I was like, "Come on, we got to go see the inauguration and just sort of see the swearing in." And he was like, why we gotta do that? Like, so like he was like really frustrated, like, I don't understand why we gotta sit here and do this. And I was just like, wow, he didn't really get the moment. I said, what's important? You need to see this. It's like, and he made this comment that got me as young as he was. He was like, if the best person won, what's the difference? And I said, there we go. So at his age, he really understood that it's not about, okay, he's a Black man, so that what's the point? It's just like, if he's the best person, that's how I should be showing up in life. And I think, a friend of mine, she told us that, you want to raise your kids where they understand that the sun rises and sets over them. And she said, you do that because you need to reinforce their self-esteem. You have to make sure that they can compete with everything that's back from that. And I think for me, when my son used to tell us stories when he used to take, like the regional rail trains and things like that, and people, white folks wouldn't sit next to him, and he said he would notice those kind of different, he was experiencing sort of micro. And one of the things we had to keep talking to him about was that you're still good enough, and just having to reinforce that. But that comes after years and years. And so when I think about him and my older son at that point, it was just like it's this idea of how do you have to keep showing people that they're loved. I think the one thing that I realized is I had to make sure, and I think all my children, but it's like if I think about with men in particular and fathers and sons need to know that you work for them. They need to know that you're going to model how to defend them, how to protect them, and how to love them, how to encourage them. Because it isn't always about, I got to beat you down and toughen you up. Sometimes it's about, you need a hug. Sometimes it's about, this world out here is bad. And I need to say, yes, it is. And then sometimes I have to, tell them that regardless of what the stereotypes are, you're better than that. And you have to continue to have that sort of self-esteem. Like in the second book, we talk about this notion of external locus of control versus internal locus of control. So Sharon, I know you get this, but it's this idea of we can't allow our value systems to shape us from an external perspective. We need to shape ourselves internally. And I think that's how you have to pour in to men. As a father, I have to make sure that their sort of compass is something that happens from the inside, not necessarily that's going to be guided from the feedback you get on the outside world, because that's inconsistent and harmful at best sometimes.
Well, Dr. Lee, let me ask you a question. Like, what do you think that is so unique and different about Black men? Because there is a difference.
Yeah.
What do you think it is? What is that? Unique.
I'm going to keep quoting different people that I think have inspired me in terms of a lot of things. And I was thinking about Louise William Bishop. She used to be this radio host, like this gospel radio host years ago on AM. And she said something that struck me. She said, if you put a Black, and I don't know if she's just a Black person or a Black man. She said, if you put a Black man in any environment, she said, you know what happens? They tend to rise to the top. She said, just look. She said, you give them the opportunity. And I would say as Black people, I think that tends to happen. We excel. Like we tend to figure out a way to do stuff. And I feel like what makes us unique is it's this innate resilience for most of us. I will say over time, I think we're fatigued because life is hard. And I don't know generationally if I'm seeing it as much as I would like to see it in sort of younger men growing up, because it does beat you down. And, and one of the things that I would like to think about is this idea of what do we do to sort of instill that? Because I do think as Black men, we have that ability, you know, resiliency, to be leaders, to show up and make a difference. I mean, even in education, they talk about when you bring in one Black male teacher, you can improve educational outcomes. Right. So it's like just the notion of presence is powerful. So I think, you know, when we talk about sort of what's unique about us, I think that the ideal of our presence can make a difference. And you got to think in my life, I've been in a lot of places where I have been the only Black man, sometimes the only Black person. So in terms of sort of spaces and places and things. So, and I think having that ability to tolerate and hold that space and still be visible is powerful too.
So what would you say have been your most challenging, you know, because of the fact that you're in these circles where you are the only one? What's so challenging? What has been the most challenging?
You know, I think it's competing with that sense of isolation. You know, I think and remembering that you have to learn that the constant is you. What I find is that if I allow sort of where I'm at to dictate sort of my experience of myself, I could leave tattered. And that could be in a matter of moments and days. Right. And so some of the things that I think that you have to do, and I'll go from experiences of riding in first class. I tell people I try to ride first class as much as I can. If you offering, I'm gonna try to get it. It's like so. And I said, but even that, I'll have people make assumptions that I'm in the military. I'll have people make assumptions that you in my seat. I'll have people make assumptions about all of these things, even though I'm like, I know I paid, and I know I'm in my right place. Right. It's like so, and you know, and I think it's nice that they think, you know, I served my country, but I'm like, I'm not in the military. I was never there. So it's like, but it goes back to even when people think in a very good-hearted way that you can experience these hostilities just based on who you are. And I think that's the part when you're, you know, in those experiences of sort of being alone and sort of kind of being like where you're just, you don't have a whole lot of people who may identify with that or how you can communicate. And I will say this, and, you know, I tell people, Trump did one good thing for me. I said he allowed us to say racism is real. Before, people used to say, you got to tell people, I said, you don't know their hearts, you know, you got to think about what they say. Now you can say that's racist. That's not right. That's this, that, and the other. And I said, it also gave me, because where I used to have to rationalize people's behaviors toward me, where I'm saying this is what happened. And they would say, no, what about that? Like I would have to prove it. Like, you know, like, and I'm like, now I'm to the point I don't have to do that anymore. I'm like, that was uncomfortable. What you said or did wasn't right. And now it's up to the other people to say, oh, is that yes or not? And I think that lifts a burden off of us, particularly as Black men, because at some point, you know, when you're reacting to some sort of microaggression, then you're like the angry Black man. Right. Or, you know, or if you're just getting tired of it and you're withdrawn, because some of this is about keeping you down. And I think we have to challenge ourselves. How do we stay up in the midst of all of these struggles?
Oh, so wow. Speaking of the struggles, share some of the challenges for Black men, you know, especially today, but some struggles were before and they're still present. But what are some of the things that you're seeing as a clinician, as a psychologist, as well as a Black man? What are some of the challenges?
You know, for me, I'm a go on my stick about relationships. I think that this whole interpersonal kind of experience between Black men and Black women. You know, I told one young guy, I said, I think as an older now, you know, sort of seasoned Black man, I said, I don't know if we did y'all justice because we didn't model for y'all about how to show up as men in relationships. Right. Like I said, because that's what's missing. And what I find is it isn't, you know, when I talk to Black women about where's a good Black man and, you know, and all of that, and I tell people they're around, but I think something happened in terms of expectations. I told people where, you know, it's that basic scripture. I always go back to when my grandma used to ask the question, like, who you courting, baby? And I'm like, Grandma, what you mean courting? And she was just like, you know, who do you have intentions on? It's like it's like, and I said, but the ideal was I was doing something. Like I was working, it's like when a man finds a wife, he finds a good thing. It's like, but it's something happening where that energy isn't there, where Black men aren't showing up in that way. And part of me makes me wonder about how do we feel about ourselves in terms of our self-esteem, our self-worth, our value, and stuff like that. And how does that contribute to this lack of investment in healthy relationships? And then it kind of gets me into some sort of thoughts in the new book where we're talking about like the transparent truths. Like as Black men, can we confront our pain points and really be in a space of balanced vulnerability, where we can sort of say the things we need to say. We have a partner who can hold the things we need to say and experience. And then in that, we can create a dynamic. And I think that's where, I think one of the biggest struggles, I think particularly with Black men that we're facing, is this idea of kind of connecting the words and our emotions, showing up in a way where we can be our emotional selves, in a relationship and not view that as anything other than masculine, like it's something that, detracts from who you are and how you do it. And I feel like that's kind of one of my biggest ones. I know I've been talking a lot about racism, but I do think it's how do we grow and mature mostly as men. I think it's something that we really need to talk about at home.
I totally agree with you, Dr. Lee. I want to actually do a show, like one show, an episode, but actually have a show dedicated to relationships between men and women, and specifically Black men and women, because we struggle so much. And, there's a lot of chatter and some of it nonsense, on social media, where people don't really understand that we don't understand ourselves, which is why we don't show up the right way in our relationships. But we're not talking about that because a lot of that is mental health and psychological, et cetera, our history and how it's affecting us, how trauma, racism, everything is affecting us. And then that takes a toll on how we show up in relationships. But we're thinking about other things. And so that emotional aspect of the relationship and of, the Black man, I think is so, so, so important. So I'm putting my plug out here now. When I do that series, or have that panel discussion, if you would be a part of that, I would so appreciate it, because it's so
I love that word.
Yeah, because actually, and one of the questions that Sandra and I were going to ask you is like, and I might as well ask it now, with that, the alarming incarceration rate, husbandless homes, fatherless homes, violence in the community, and all these things affecting the Black community, the Black household, and it was specifically Black men. What do you see? I mean, the whole thing is so challenging. What do you see as a Black man that other Black men, say, who don't fall in those categories can do? So, based on like what you said, you think maybe your generation, the generation before you, et cetera, maybe didn't pass the torch as well as you could have to the younger generation, because something has happened. And so we think, okay, that could be one reason. Okay, and I'm probably sure there's others, but what do you think can be done to turn this tide into a more positive, a forward direction with our younger male generations in relationships and all the other things that I just mentioned?
Well, I think first we have to have hope. I think that's one. And even thinking about, like, when you mentioned a lot of those statistics, I could probably say most of them I've experienced in my own family. So whether it's incarceration, fatherlessness, those kind of things, I'm like, I get it. And as I turned out okay. It's kind of like, and I think we have to believe that that's possible. That's number one. I think the other piece is really thinking about what resources we have in our lives. So sometimes if you don't have, your father there, it may be another man that's around that should be invested in you. And the one thing that struck me, and I will say this, and I thought this was a real interesting strength of sort of the generation younger than me, where I saw, and I said, if I had the time, the energy, or maybe if I was in school and didn't have nothing else to do and had to do a dissertation, I would want to study how I feel like some Black men pay it forward. I thought it was really interesting, where I used to see how some Black men would raise other Black men's children. Now, the interesting part, they might not be around their own full time,
Right.
but they're taking care of the children in somebody else's household and are invested in caring for them and everything else. And I started watching that phenomenon where I was just like, oh, it's sort of interesting that, they take care of who's in front of them,
Right.
and they're a resource for the ones in front of them and claim them just like they're theirs,
Right.
And it doesn't mean that they're not connected to their own children, but it's that they might see their children more on a part-time basis, where they might just get them for the weekends or whatever that is. And so what that showed me is that there are strengths in our community, that we do invest, we do build those relationships, and we can be those preventative and perfect those protective factors. I think as men, I think what has to happen is we have to be more intentional around that process. And I think, with these, I would say with the children and young people growing up today, we thought we were the show me generation, but they are truly the show me generation. They're like, you're just not going to talk to me. You got to be connected to me. I got to know who you are. I got to understand you're invested. And then I think what ends up happening, if you have men, and this is not just Black men, but just men who just don't know how to be that emotionally available and connected, because they might not had that experience for themselves or that connected to themselves. And how are you going to do that for somebody younger? So I feel like it is this idea that we have to start normalizing this idea of how to grow our emotional selves, and then allowing ourselves to understand that that's a typical expectation. But when you allow yourself to be that present, then you can be present for somebody else. And I feel like that's the challenge right now, is that, I remember doing a presentation when I used to returning citizens years ago. And I used to talk about this idea of hollow souls. And I said, if you think about sort of this idea of how can I harm someone? How can I sort of do some horrific things to people and not really be connected to it? It's like, because at some level, I'm thinking they don't have a soul. And the reason I could think that is because I don't think I got one either. So if I don't have it, and I don't think you have it, then guess what? Anything goes. I could treat you any old kind of way. I could do anything to you because there's nothing here. It's a shell of an experience. And I think at some point we have to have the courage. And I think this goes back into some of the about like courageous self-reflection, that so you can look at yourself and tap into that and understand that if you have it, then you have to extend that same sort of belief and sort of divine right to everybody else.
Dr. Lee, let me ask you this. Are you seeing a lot or any Black men coming to you for therapy? And if so, what is some of the main things they're coming for?
So I'll be honest. It's like I love doing therapy with men. I think it's like they're my favorite group of people, and that's regardless of Black, white, whatever. It's just like I think they're just the fun bunch to work with. Okay. And what I will say, when I'm thinking about, I think about these two experiences with some younger college age men, and thinking about both of them, it really was dealing with this in their lives. For one, he was really stuck and struggling with this idea of having to possibly move out and live on campus because the stress in his sort of home was so much that he just couldn't become available for school and just his own life. And it was this idea of, am I betraying or abandoning, and not just his mom, but like a younger sibling. Like, I'm gonna have to leave my younger sibling in this place. So, it's like sort of that notion of survivor's remorse, like how do I kind of have to deal with the fact that I might be able to get better and struggle through that versus knowing that it's a mess. And it was interesting because his father would tell him, you got to get out of there. There's nothing you can do for your mom. It's like if you stay, it's like a bottomless pit. Like, you have to make a decision about taking care of you because that's who she is. And but even that was a struggle. So he said he knows his dad was right. It was just really like pulling at him. around, and like, and again, part of it was he was like, I didn't want to be like my father, feel like I'm abandoning her. But then he finally was like, I get it. He didn't abandon her. He just said, this is all I can do. Like, I can't make your mom change and do anything different. So I think those are some of the struggles. I think the other pieces in terms of relationships is sort of how relationships affect, I think, men's identity, and how we have to work to really help, like kind of what I was talking about earlier. How do you shore that up? Like, how, and if you're over reliant on other people's perceptions and perspective of yourself, that external dependence could really throw you for a loop. So if that person loves you one day, gaslights you the next, you like, well, who am I? It's like that sense of uncertainty around that. So I think for some men have to really sort of start establishing that identity and just that confident identity and being able to communicate. And then I think lastly, some of it is relationship work. It's sort of like when I particularly I get when I think about couple work that comes across my sometimes it's the man really struggling that like with how do I sort of manage this, and sometimes it's dealing with conflict in relationships. What does that mean? This notion of, does conflict mean abandonment? Are there other ways to communicate without being combative? I be vulnerable and safe, and then and work with a partner to develop that for me. So, so those are some of the topics that come up.
Okay. Okay.
You're muted, Sharon.
Sharon, we can't hear you.
My bad. This question came to my mind as you were talking. On social media, and probably before, but a lot on social media, I'm sure you have heard many in the manosphere, what they call the manosphere. And have you heard of that?
Yeah.
Okay. And so they talk a lot about the alpha male, the beta male, and the simp, right? And you're familiar with these terms, correct? Okay.
Me and my son had this conversation. Yeah.
Okay. So, I listened to it, and I'm not a black man, but I have my thoughts about it. But I want to get your thoughts on those terms and what they mean, and is it really valid, or is that really just surface? Because people aren't really looking inward. And one caveat that I think is missing is the God piece. And because if you put the God piece in there, then you look at males and females differently and their roles. So can you speak a little bit about that as a black man?
I got a lot to say about this stuff, but it's only a one question, so I'll look in.
Well, you can share other stuff about that if you like.
Yeah. So, and I guess for me, I'll maybe summarize all of this. I don't want to get necessarily into defining terms, and I don't even want to disparage anybody who sort of listens to that. It resonates with them, and it sort of makes sense. It is what it is. I think for me, because I want to even get into this whole notion of masculine energy, feminine energy. I want to talk a little bit about that because I think that's part of this conversation, and it sort of spins out of this manosphere world. And sometimes the work I do on my social media platform is to address that, because a lot of it is it's a lot of misnomers. I think misinformation, disinformation, and I think we talk to each other from stereotypes and caricatures of who we are, not necessarily like the whole person. And then even when you mention spiritually, it's sometimes people even distort that, in terms of how they, I tell people they could justify slavery when you think about when they do. So it's like, so you really got to be conscious and careful of sort of all of those things that come into place. But for me, my concern about this manosphere world is that I think there are men who are looking for a sense of identity. I said, so I think that's natural. It's something that we all want, and we all want to understand who we are. I think, like they say in the life, environments abhor vacuums. And I think the manosphere fills a vacuum. It creates a space for people who are like, I need to understand myself. Because again, I think for a lot of us, particularly as men, it's this notion of erasure. So when you think about for us as Black men, that's probably our biggest sort of competing force is being erased in terms of just who we are, being valid, being present, being valued, and things like that. So then a reaction to that is this constant sort of competition around I have to overinflate to address for that. So now I'm competing with everybody. So, I gotta be the alpha male, the top dog in terms of that. I can't find myself in a relationship that is equitable or where there's fluid flexibility. It's this notion of dominance. And that's like I have to be on top to make it work or I didn't win, in terms of this discussion. But for me, when I hear all of these conversations and sometimes listening to the language and this idea that it has to be us versus them and what othering is sort of the dynamic, whether you're othering other men, you're othering women in the process, then it just makes me think about this idea of insecurity. I just can't help but jump to that. It's like, and what makes me think about is I don't have to devalue other people to feel better about myself.
Right.
And I feel like at some point, that's kind of what gets me with this language around what I hear in this manosphere is that I'm constantly finding ways to create value, personal value at the expense of others. And as I talk about sort of a stage in a new book, we have to rediscover our own personal value. And that's not at the expense of other people. And sometimes we have to look at our own experience, good, bad, or different, and find value in that. And so for me, going back to my story, it's this idea of, and I used to be like, oh my God, I was poor, this and that. And it was going back to how do you love yourself as a Black man. And I used to be like, oh man, being poor is a terrible thing. But then what I realized was all of the sacrifices my mother made for me. Then I sat in the midst of that. So then I found value in that. So it was like, so when you start finding value in your experiences, it changes things. And then you internalize that value. And I think right now people are looking at, and it's funny, they're trying to take an approach of managing situations, people, and things they can't control to develop personal value. Because personal value starts from you. I can't control a woman. I can't control how people think about me. I can't control sometimes how much money I'm gonna get, and depending on how hard I'm gonna work and this and that. Some things I can't control. It's like, but I can control how I show up based on all of those components.
Right.
And I can be consistent with that. And then that changes things because then I can see value in you because I understand there's value in me. And if you're rejecting my value, then you ain't for me. I'm just gonna move on because sooner or later somebody's gonna be like, I like what I see. Let's figure this out and sort of come together with like minds. And then that sort of shifts me to this whole conversation. Dr. Marquita and I've been having these conversations around this whole energy around masculine energy, feminine energy. And I've been, and like I tell everybody, there's no distinction in energy. Women who are leaders, who sort of make money, however you want to call them, like they sort of take care of things. They are no more masculine than a man who does whatever he does. It's kind of like I said, I think it's like, how are we equating some behaviors to masculine versus feminine? Qualities are qualities. Character is character. It's like, so, but now we're starting to see it's almost less like, well, here's another excuse that I can't find a man or a woman because this woman is trying to show up like me. This man is trying to show up like me. And it's like, like versus these are just character traits. It's like, they're not, one of them, men and women can both have leadership skills. Right. Men and women can both be successful and hardworking. Right. It's like, so for me, I feel like that we're finding more reasons in relationships in this like manosphere space and all this other stuff to sort of create disconnection than we are finding ways to connect. Because guess what? It's not too many women who are going to be okay with you dominating them. You ain't going to walk in the house and say, you're going to do this, do that, do the other. And they like, look, I pay these bills too. It's like I don't know too many women. Now, it might be some who like it. I'm not going to say, but I'm just going to say it's not too many in my mind. That's going to be like, I'm okay with that. Right. And so neither will a man want that. So who's gonna be like, you gonna tell me this, that, and that? So I think what we have to understand is how do we sort of come into a space where we're secure enough together to grow together. And I think that's what I feel like that's what is not being fed to folks who are, you know, sort of stirring up in this social media world and connecting around those themes. It's some undoing work that has to happen, I think, in terms of the way we think. But I think part of that undoing has to be around like this false sense of perfection that I think people are bringing in and projecting on other people. And people have to be okay with sort of expressing what their true longings are. Most people want to be connected and they're mad that they're not. And it's like, so we have to really work towards how do we teach people to build connections, not buy into these philosophies that are doing the very thing they don't want, which is they're still alone, most of them, and they're still not in healthy relationships.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, that
was I said a whole lot, but I could say
said a whole lot, but it was all good. There was a lot of stuff you said, but we got all of it, and it was all very, very good.
Absolutely.
In reference to Sharon brought up, you know, the spirit, you know, God and the whole thing. What do you think about the fact that there's not so many men in church? Do you have any thoughts on, like, if you're looking at a church, it is predominantly women, right? And so, like, do you have any thought, like, come on, where they at? You know,
it's so funny, and I also think is this a myth too. So we always laugh at our church when they say all the men come down and we pray, and then when they fill up if the whole part of the altar, people are like, oh my God, it's all these men here. It's like so I just be like, well, I haven't seen that. Maybe that is a myth. So, and I gonna say it's not true in other places. I do think, you know, particularly if we're talking about Black churches, a lot of them are, you know, sort of kind of led and sort of supported by a lot of Black women. But what I feel like too has to happen is this ideal of what it means to be as a man. And I think traditionally, and I would say in some churches, experiences, and when you think about growing up, it was a lot of men in church, and church represented opportunities for leadership and visibility, you know, so you could be a deacon, you know, you could be a trustee, you could be a pastor, you know, but the ideal was you could experience yourself in church in ways you couldn't experience yourself in. And things like that. And so I feel like that's still some of the opportunities there. I feel like, you know, sometimes Christianity gets feminized, and particularly when we think about who Christ is and how he shows up in the world. When I tell people I love the Book of Clarence, if you haven't saw it, it's a really good movie and a really good spin on sort of what that looks like in terms of showing up, in terms of experience, and particularly as men in this Christian experience. But I feel like for the most part, and I think as men, sometimes we don't model sort of what it is to be a Christian man, you know, to really show up in sort of a way where people want like to emulate us, where they're just like, I see, oh, this is the benefits of being a Christian, and these are the rewards of it. And at times, you know, I think also being a Christian man, if you're thinking about this, it's a lived experience. So for me, you know, it's not just saying I'm a Christian just because I go to church on, you know, Sunday and I work in my little men's group and I do this, that, and the other. It's about how do I show up every day?
Right.
You know, and then how do I show up and how am I visible to men who aren't Christians?
Right.
You know, how am I letting these young men who, you know, who are unchurched or left the church or having those conversations, and how am I staying connected and not being judging? Right. You know, just being present, allowing them to show up for who they are and how they are. And I think what we also have to understand is that a lot of men, you know, they talk about, you know, church is a hospital for the sick. It's like, so it's kind of like, it's a lot of broken people coming in.
A lot of broken.
And then sometimes we don't support them in the work they need to heal. And I think, and for some of the men, it's this expectation that do we create the space and the environment for them to download,
Mm-hmm.
you know, to sort of let them share their pain, their
Mm-hmm.
vulnerability, and encourage them so they could see it as a resource. So it's like, and for some, maybe they struggle to do that,
Okay.
you know, and they struggle to have that space to find that moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right.
So, Dr. Lee, you were saying earlier about how, when that divide that happened, and maybe the older Black male community didn't, translate how to be in relationships with the younger Black male population. Do you think that's similar with the church? Because, like you said, there were more Black men in church years ago. Then something happened, right? And now you have young people, and I know someone who's older than me. He's never stepped foot in a church,
Wow.
was never even introduced to church, and that's odd at my age.
Yeah.
Because I had to go. It was like, you can't live in this house.
Okay.
Right. So, but but so what do you think happened? That part of it?
And it goes back to, we're not a monolith. So, and I think in terms of just even how people are exposed. Number two, for me, I think about sometimes where how do we allow men to show up as men, and sometimes in very visible, clear ways, and that's something I feel like that gets sort of lost in the process. And I think with Christianity, it's not as much about legalism. It's not about how what you wear, or how you show up, or this and that. It's an eternal experience. And I think that's a different kind of work, that has to happen. And you also have to be self-motivated,
right.
To sort of think about sort of what that means, and understand that gratification comes through the struggle sometimes. So I tell people, Christianity is not glamorous. It is not something that even anybody gonna gravitate to when you really think about all of this stuff you got to do. it's a sacrifice, and having to be in that position to sort of do that on a daily basis, sometimes a moment by moment basis, and maybe in some ways that you feel like doesn't represent who you are in terms of your masculine self. So turn it up cheek, like humble sometimes. Like, I talk about this notion of shrinking to grow, but when you talk about this idea of shrinking to grow, it really is helping you to mature. Like, you have to sort of humble yourself to learn in a moment, so you can be better in that next moment. And then, but all of those things really, for some people, don't sound like they're masculine traits. We're taught to go out, to achieve, to conquer, to subdue, to sort of fight for what you want. And sometimes that isn't how Christianity works. And it could be this tension point. It was this book called Wild at Heart. This Christian author talked about, and that's what he said. Like, he said, how are we creating these experiences for men where they could do what's natural for them, which is to accomplish, achieve, become. And we need to really make sure they have those same opportunities that you want in the natural space that you have in your spiritual space too. That includes churches.
Okay. All right, Sharon, there's a question here. It says, why do men feel less masculine when a woman, his wife, makes more money than he does? Good question.
I was going to say, years ago, and this is not a new phenomenon, and this kind of gets into that whole simp thing and this whole masculine energy in women, but years ago, they were talking about dating, and they was talking about this notion of, is it okay for to sort of marry down? Now, remember, men could do that. Women can marry up. They can marry men that could be more wealthy, have more resources, and that probably been going on since the beginning of time. But it is what it is. It's like, that's an okay standard. But then what we found is that, particularly in the Black community, women are getting more educated. They're making more money. They're in more professional positions. They're in more leadership positions. So compared to Black men, so I told people, me and Oprah would have been married. I could have been Mr. Oprah all my life. Because I was like, man, I'm gonna lock this down. I should have had at least one kid because I'm gonna get some alimony.
Right.
It's like so I think, but that goes back to this idea of how secure can you be, because it's not necessarily this whole ideal about are you using wealth and resources as your standard for your personal identity and sense of value. You have to look at everything you bring to the table, because guess what? Whether regardless of how much money somebody makes, they still want to roll over to somebody and rub an arm at night and say, hey, it's good that you're here. I want to be able to talk to somebody. Can you give me a glass of water? You know, so that doesn't matter whether you make $10 or $100 more. You want somebody to say, can we go out to dinner and do this and hang out and just travel together? We love companionship. We want to be connected. So I think for men, we have to understand that it's what we bring is equitable. So for me, I've heard stories where the woman made more than the husband, but he had the expectation of running the house because that's what the father did. That's what they saw, paying all of the bills, doing all this stuff, but they didn't have the financial resources to do what the father did for them. But then, and they weren't going to contribute. So I'm like, that you can't live like that. Like, you got to be like, how are we doing this together? Because it's about equitable contributions. It's not about equal. Equal is not equitable. Look, this is what you bring. This is what I'm gonna bring. And so, and then everybody works towards it. I've heard of stories where, you know, the woman made more money because she was a director of an agency. That particular husband, he worked 2 full-time jobs, you know, because that's what he wanted to do. And, you know, to make sure he could do what he wanted to do to contribute and to help build the life that they wanted. So it's like everybody picks and chooses how they want to manage those situations. But the ideal is about equity. It's about what are you bringing to the table and valuing that. So you can't diminish the person's sort of worth because they're making less than you. And you have to say, you know, these are the bills you got. This is what I got. Y'all have to find a way that makes sense in terms of organizing your money and your resources. So y'all grow and build together. Because if you're together, it's all your money. It doesn't matter. Like it to me, I look at it as a pot. So it's like, this is all we bring in, and this is how we using all we bring in to do whatever we want to do and live the life we want. And to me, if that's coming up, I would really get to the root of it, because then it's probably not the issue about money. It's how I feel about money. And I think sometimes we have to have that conversation around if you're using money as a guide and you're still using that standard that the breadwinner is the one who makes the most. And then if I'm not the breadwinner, I might not necessarily be entitled to be the leader of this home and things like that. And that's all the stuff you got to work out. So, because nobody said that was a requirement to be the head of your household or anything else. And being a breadwinner means you're bringing something to the table. Doesn't mean you're bringing all. It might not even bring you got the full load. Somebody else could be part of the load too.
Right.
That's right. So true. Such good points. But Dr. Lee, I want you to, we're going to pivot because it's already 9:01. Talk to the audience, talk to us about what's in your book that's going to help us and Black men specifically, if we follow some of the tenets in your book that you're going to talk about, how that can help some of the challenges that we've even talked about tonight.
Well, I've been sort of salt and peppering the conversation with some of the terms you hear, like shrink to grow, transparent truth, sort of acknowledging your pain points, you know, thinking about rediscovering your personal value, this idea, you know, of stretching, you know, yourself, undoing, you know, and then really having that motivation. I think, to me, what I want to tell everybody is your ability to grow is really your responsibility. And you have to be intentional about it and sort of making sure you stay in that space. And I want to go back to that quote that I started where with T.J. Rogers. It's that ideal, be realistic, demand the impossible is how I should have framed it from the beginning. And I think that's what I want people to understand is demand the impossible from yourself. And really sort of think about those areas you need to stretch and grow and to become. And that's really the purpose of the book. It's really that you sort of, you kind of get away from a sense of complacency and sort of move away from the stuckness to sort of stay sharp and to use that to develop whatever areas of life. It could be your spiritual life, your relational life, sort of your emotional life, is whatever you need to do, your financial life. whatever you need to do. So that's really what the goal is. And the ideal is understanding that that's perpetual. You know, you're going to be doing that, you know, until the day you die. And if you're planning on seeing Jesus, until you see him. That's like, so that's how I would look at it.
Okay.
So Dr. Lee, is that what you were just talking about? Is that in your upcoming book?
That would be, yes. And do what you're built. Yes. Yeah. Do what you're built for is similar to that. I think it's just, it's kind of a more refined kind of language than the current book. I think the newer book, I think just meets the moment in terms of where people are at.
Okay, so can you let the audience know? I have on the screen Do What You're Built For. That's the book that's already out that people can purchase.
That's the first book.
Where can they purchase that book?
You can get that anywhere you buy books. So if you know, everybody lives on Amazon, you can get it from there. Anywhere you get a book, you can find it.
All right, so that's Do What You're Built For, already out, and that's by Dr. Lee. The next one that's coming out, when can we expect 6 Stages for Purposeful Living? When can we expect that to be out?
I'm hoping, depending on the publisher and the editor, maybe fall of 2025. So I'm thinking maybe fall, winter 2025.
Okay, and it'll be available on all platforms as well?
Yes, on all platforms. And if you follow us on our social media, and primarily we're on Instagram at Built For, the number 4 Collective, then you will be doing posts and things like that. And that pretty much, like, I'll be using a lot of the content over the next year or so around the book to sort of tease it and get people to some of the language and the activities.
Okay, so the final question, leave the audience with your top 3 things that's on that should be, if I can use the word should lightly, on the Black man's list for their next to overcome, whether it's, you know, like you were talking about, you just answered the question.
Well, I'll be real quick. I'll add one. So we've been talking about relationships, your emotional self, and I would also say vote. You know, Black men, we got to vote like our lives depend on it, and we got to get away from these around what voting means and doesn't. So that will be my last point. Vote and make sure you invest in your vote and in your freedom. So that's what I will leave people with.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. This was
you.
Good.
So we already got you locked in with a yes, I think earlier, with a future show about relationships and between Black men and Black women. And I'll call on Dr. Marquita to be a part of that panel as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh, she would love it.
Yes, absolutely. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is our show for this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's see, I think something else. Okay, Charmaine just said that is so true, Dr. Lee. Don't know which comment that was because you said so much that was so true. So let's see here. Netta says good show, and thank you all for watching. And if you didn't make a comment, I can't shout you out, but that's okay. Thank you so much for watching anyway. And Amira, Aisha, Ayana, and a few other people who were watching, Kevin and Honey Bunches. Rita, hi Rita, Kathleen, thank you all for watching. If I missed anyone's name, I'm sorry, I'm going through this right now, but we so appreciate you watching. We hope you got something, a lot from this show tonight with Dr. Lee. He's an awesome in the field of psychology and mental health. And so again, Dr. Lee, give your IG information or website again, just so people, if they want to contact you, they can.
Yeah, no problem. So please follow us. It's Built, the number 4 Collective. And that's everything. Do what you're built for.
Okay.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching. Next week, we're going to have Dr. Walters back again. We're talking about Black men and mental health. He's joining us again, August the 7th. Dr. Randolph Walters. He's he should just become a host now, right? Co-host with us, right?
That's right. I'll slide over.
That's my man.
Nicole Lucas says hi. Hi, Nicole.
Hey, Nicole.
One of our besties. You know, Dr. Walters, Dr. Lee?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome.
We're real good friends here.
Okay, he's on my dissertation committee, and he's a professor at my school.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, all right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much, Sandra, for joining me
so
again
much.
another week. And Dr. Lee, as
Absolutely.
always, thank you so much for taking out your time to
Thank
share your wisdom, expertise,
Yes.
knowledge, etc. We
It was so
appreciate you.
good.
It was.
Thank
It
you.
really was. So we'll see you next Wednesday for Black Men and Mental Health. Next
Yeah.
Wednesday, 8 p.m. Same station, same bat time, same bat channel. You know
That's
where
right.
it is. Like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow the page. Do that right now. Doesn't cost you anything, but it helps us out so much. So do that right now. Thank you so much. God bless you. Shalom.
Shalom. All right.